Thank you, Mr President. My question without notice is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Abetz. And I ask, given that the Prime Minister has promised that Australian families will be $550 better off with the abolition of carbon pricing, and your confirmation today that that $550 figure was from Treasury modelling, will you now admit that the $550 figure included $250 for food, clothing and rent, and that these won't be covered by the government's price pass-through provisions? Will you now admit that the $550 promise to Australian families is a lie?
The Leader of the Government in the Senate and the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Abetz.
Mr President, I can confirm to the honourable senator that the sort of language she uses doesn't reflect well on her, but is also incorrect. Earlier today, if the honourable senator would have listened, she would have heard me respond to a question with information from a small businessman, I think from a Lullaby, who confirmed that Qantas has already written to advise that effective from the 1st of July, the carbon tax surcharge would be removed from freight. So there is a living—
Point of order. Pause the clock. Senator Milne.
Thank you, Mr President. My point of order is relevance. I'm asking about the Treasury modelling that includes $250 for food, clothing and rent that won't be passed on under your provisions. Is that true or not?
There's no point of order. The minister's only just got to a quarter through his question, and he is being relevant to the question. Minister.
Mr President, the question was, would the savings be passed through? I'm giving the honourable senator a real-life example where the savings are already being passed through in anticipation of the repeal of the carbon tax. A real-life example. But of course, the senator doesn't want to hear that, wants to scare the Australian community, so midstream of my answer she has to raise a point of order, hoping that that information will not get out to the Australian people. Mr President, the Treasury modelling that was undertaken by the previous Labor government said in general terms that the average Australian household will have an impost of $550 per annum as a result of the carbon tax. It stands to reason that part of that $550 impost will be higher energy prices, but also costs that will be impacted on the chain on the way through. So, for example, the Qantas example that I gave, one would hope that fish can now be delivered cheaper in Australia because of Qantas doing its bit, and as a result there will be cheaper prices for Australian consumers when they want to
Minister,
eat their
the time for
fish and
answering the question has expired. Senator Milne, a supplementary question.
Yes, thank you, Mr President, and this is also to the hopeful minister. Can he now confirm that the Canberra Business FROSPAC, which the Prime Minister and Minister Hunt said would pay an extra $60,000 a year because of synthetic greenhouse gases, can you confirm that that business will be subject to penalties if it doesn't pass on the total $60,000 in so-called savings?
Minister.
Mr President, I'm not aware of this particular business, but I do understand. And Senator Milne interjects and says the Prime Minister is, and can I say there are lots of things the Prime Minister's aware of that I'm not necessarily aware of, and I'm more than willing to wear that. And if the Prime Minister wants to provide more information, I'll come back to the Senate in relation to that. But as I understand the amendments, synthetic greenhouse gases being imported into Australia will be part of the proposal, the swag of amendments that will be considered later on today in the House of Representatives.
Final supplementary, Senator Milne.
Yes, thank you, Mr President. Minister, given that Woolworths has said that it avoided price rises when the carbon price was introduced so it has no cost savings to pass on, and Qantas has said that it didn't increase airfares so it can't pass on any savings to passengers, will the Prime Minister guarantee that every family will now be $550 better off, a guarantee?
Minister.
Mr President, look, these are the sort of immature word games that the Greens love to revel in. What we have always said is the average Australian family will be $550 better off. Senator Milne, by a sleight of hand, translates that to every Australian family. It stands to reason that when you say the average Australian family, some families will be will get even more of a benefit than $550 per annum, and some will get less. That's what the term average actually means, Senator. You know that, I know that. So why you would seek to deceive the Australian people by that sleight of language is for you to explain, but it does you no credit.